The flight attendant's smile shifted into something colder the moment Jordan Ellis stepped into first class. He was only 17, his frame lean and athletic from basketball, his headphones hanging loose around his neck. His confidence carried more in silence than in swagger. His boarding pass read, "Seat 2A." But when he lowered into the plush leather, a stewardess leaned in and whispered words that cracked through his calm. "Sir, you must have made a mistake. This section isn't for you." At first, Jordan thought, he had misheard. His father, a man who drilled into him the values of humility and preparedness, had gifted him this ticket as recognition for his hard work, his scholarship interviews, his resilience through a long year of quiet battles. But within 5 minutes, that recognition was ripped away. The stewardess returned, this time with another attendant, their voices firmer. "You'll need to move back to economy, now." Passengers' eyes sharpened, scanning his skin, his youth, and nothing else. Jordan's heart raced, not just from humiliation but from the way the air tightened with judgment. It wasn't about a misplaced ticket. It was about who they believed deserved comfort and who they believed did not. He could feel every second stretching, the cabin a courtroom, his presence on trial. Still, he sat quietly, phone in his hand, fingers trembling over the screen. He didn't know it yet, but a single call was about to flip the entire outcome. His father's name, unknown to these attendants, carried weight far beyond the seat. Number on a boarding pass. And when that call was answered, the entire aircraft, hundreds of lives suspended in transit, would come to a halt. Here's what that moment teaches us. Injustice often arrives quietly, in ordinary places, at ordinary times. But power, when rooted in truth and strategy, has a way of rearranging the air itself. The question is, how did Jordan end up here, in this moment where bias clashed with destiny, and why did it take one phone call to ground an entire plane? That is where the story truly begins. Jordan Ellis was not supposed to be invisible, but too often the world treated him that way, until his presence made someone uncomfortable. He was a scholar-athlete, the kind of student teachers whispered about with pride, disciplined on the court, sharper still in the classroom. His father, Charles Ellis, was a tech entrepreneur who had risen from a childhood of scarcity to become a CEO respected in boardrooms across the country. Yet Charles always reminded his son, "Excellence will not shield you from ignorance, but it will prepare you to respond with dignity and precision." That lesson hung over Jordan like armor, though it was armor constantly tested. Growing up, he had seen the subtle ways bias slipped into daily life, security guards trailing him at malls, teachers surprised by his advanced reading level, coaches assuming his future was only in athletics, not academics. Each incident carried the same unspoken message: you are out of place. His father explained it plainly one evening. Systems are designed to question your right to belong. The question is, will you question yourself, or will you hold the line? That day on the plane was no accident of error or miscommunication. It was the product of a broader pattern. Society's reflex to doubt the legitimacy of young black. Brilliance when it appears in spaces reserved for privilege. First class was not just a section of the plane. It was a metaphor. A small world within the larger cabin, symbolizing access, status, and belonging. And when Jordan walked in, it disturbed the unspoken order. For the attendants, his presence was suspicious before it was valid. For the passengers, his youth and skin color overrode the authority of his ticket. This is how systemic injustice works, not always through overt aggression, but through subtle dismissals that say, "Prove you deserve to be here." Jordan didn't know it yet, but this small humiliation was the echo of centuries of gatekeeping, where access was denied not because of ability, but because of identity. And here's what that moment teaches us. The root cause of injustice is, rarely, a single person's bias. It is a pattern repeated over time, so normalized that the perpetrators often believe they are just doing their job. Jordan was not fighting a stewardess. He was colliding with a system designed to doubt his legitimacy before his humanity. The story of this flight is not just about where Jordan sat. It is about what happens when centuries of doubt meet one young man's quiet resolve, and the phone call that turned the rules upside down. But before that moment of reversal, Jordan would face a choice that would define not just his flight, but his future. Jordan Ellis sat frozen, the weight of two choices pressing against him. On one side was silence, to obey quietly, gather his things, and shuffle back to economy while the watching eyes of strangers confirmed what the attendants already believed, that he didn't belong. On the other side was resistance, not the kind that makes headlines, but the kind that risks further humiliation, escalation, or even being removed from the flight altogether. For a 17-year-old, that was no small calculation. He could feel the sting of shame crawling up his neck, his pulse loud in his ears. Around him, no one spoke in his defense. The man in the aisle seat cleared his throat impatiently. A woman across the row raised an eyebrow as if to say, "Why prolong this?" Every gesture around him pressed the same unspoken demand. Give in, so we can all go back to comfort. Jordan thought of his father's words, ones he had heard in countless late-night conversations. When you're confronted with injustice, you'll always be offered an easier path, the path of silence. But silence, son, is not neutral. It leaves the system intact. And here he was, at that very crossroads. Give in, and the attendant's narrative would stand unchallenged. Resist, and he could be painted as disruptive, the stereotype of the angry, young black man that too often ends with authority closing ranks against him. The fork in the road was not just about where he would sit on the plane. It was about who he would be in the face of injustice, a passenger accepting the small theft of dignity, or a young man willing to carry the risk of being misunderstood in order to affirm his truth. The behavioral psychology of this moment is something every human being knows, the freeze of social pressure. Studies show that when authority figures confront an individual in public, the brain enters a conflict between conformity and authenticity. The safer route is to conform. It reduces risk in the moment, but it often compounds harm over time. Jordan felt that pull deeply. The attendants' voices carried authority. The passenger's silence amplified it. His own voice, if he chose to use it, would feel impossibly small against the weight of the cabin. But something in him resisted folding. He didn't yet have a plan. He didn't yet know what would come of it. He only knew that giving in would wound him in ways deeper than embarrassment. It would confirm the very suspicion that followed him his whole life, that he did not have the right to belong. And so, as his hand tightened around his phone, Jordan reached for the only thread of power he had at that moment. A single action was about to flip the entire outcome. But before the reversal came, the system would test him, harder than he imagined. Jordan Ellis's hand trembled slightly as he gripped his phone, but his mind began to steady. He remembered something his father often repeated. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's knowing when to speak, and sometimes it's knowing who will speak for you. That reminder echoed now as he unlocked his screen and scrolled to the name that had always been his anchor, Dad. What no one on the plane knew was that Charles Ellis wasn't just any father. He was a CEO whose company provided key software systems used by several of the very airlines crisscrossing the globe. He had built his empire on resilience and foresight, and in boardrooms he was known for one thing: never allowing anyone to diminish his people. To the attendants, Jordan looked like a boy who could be dismissed. To those who truly knew the Ellis family, he was anything but powerless. Jordan typed a simple message. They're forcing me out of first class. Boarding pass says 2A. They won't listen. His thumb hovered for a second before hitting send. That quiet act, no confrontation, no raised voice, was his declaration. He wasn't yielding to humiliation, but neither was he giving them the image of disruption they might use against him. It was the subtle, disciplined intelligence his father had instilled. Hold your dignity, but choose your lever carefully. Here's what others missed. Jordan had been preparing for this kind of moment his whole life, even if he didn't realize it. He was the product of late-night conversations about strategy, of chess games with his father where the lesson was always the same. You don't win by reacting to their move. You win by anticipating the system itself. What looked like quiet compliance from the outside was in fact Jordan's first reversal of power, choosing not to fight their narrative on their terms, but to call upon a force they could not dismiss. He didn't know it yet, but that message was already setting off a chain reaction. Charles Ellis, sitting in his office thousands of miles away, would read it, and within minutes he would make the kind of call that transforms a private injustice into a public reckoning. The attendants thought they had clipped Jordan's wings. They didn't see that his strength wasn't in defiance but in connection, in a lineage of intelligence and authority that traveled farther than any single seat on a plane. But before that call could change the trajectory of the flight, the system wasn't finished with him. There was still one more trial to endure, the sting of public humiliation, sharpened by the silence of those who could have spoken up, but chose not to. The attendants returned with sharper edges in their voices now, their patience frayed by Jordan's refusal to move. "Sir, we need you to gather your belongings. The seat is not available to you." Their tone carried the finality of authority, the kind that dares you to resist so they can escalate further. Jordan's boarding pass rested clearly on his tray table, but they didn't glance at it. They weren't looking for evidence. They were looking for compliance. The murmurs began behind him. A man whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "Holding up the whole plane." A woman muttered, "Entitled. These kids think they can just sit anywhere." Each word pressed down heavier than the attendant's demands. Jordan felt heat rising in his chest, not just from the attack, but from the suffocating isolation. He scanned the faces around him, searching for a flicker of support, but found only lowered eyes and thin-lipped silence. Not one voice intervened. Psychologists call this the bystander effect, the paralysis of witnesses in moments of injustice. People convince themselves it is not their place to act, that someone else will step in. But in truth, silence becomes complicity. Jordan was living it in real time. The cabin wasn't neutral, its silence was a verdict. And as the attendants hovered over him, the weight of their authority was magnified by the collective absence of empathy. The humiliation cut deep. His hands clenched beneath the armrest to keep from shaking. He thought briefly of standing up, of marching back down the aisle to economy just to end the spectacle. But the cost would linger long after the flight landed. The memory of surrendering not just a seat, but his right to dignity. For a 17-year-old already navigating a world that doubted him, that wound could fester for years. This was the breaking point, the kind of moment designed to strip resolve. Jordan's ticket, his truth, his composure, none of it seemed to matter against the machinery of assumption grinding against him. And yet, he remembered what his father had told him once while teaching him to dribble under pressure. When the court feels smallest, that's when your vision must be widest. Jordan sat still, eyes forward, refusing to move. On the outside, he looked like a teenager frozen in defiance. On the inside, he was a storm of fear, pride, and quiet strategy. What no one knew, not the attendants, not the passengers, was that the chain reaction had already begun. His father had seen the message. His father was already in motion. The world around Jordan was pressing him to break. But sometimes the breaking point is also the turning point. Miles away, in a glass-walled office overlooking the city skyline, Charles Ellis's phone buzzed with his son's message. He read it once, then again, his jaw tightening with each word. Charles had been tested by prejudice all his life, boardrooms that doubted his expertise until profits proved him right, contracts rescinded until his innovation became too valuable to ignore. But this? His son, humiliated in public, stripped of dignity for daring to sit where his hard work had earned him a place. This was the moment he refused to let slide into memory. Charles exhaled slowly, his mind shifting into the clarity of a strategist. He knew anger could burn bridges, but precision could move mountains. He picked up the phone and dialed a direct line, not customer service, not a complaint desk, but a senior executive he knew personally from years of partnership. The connection was immediate, his voice steady but razor-sharp. "My son is on flight 2.227, first class, seat 2A. He is being harassed and told to leave despite holding the correct ticket. If this is how your staff treats passengers, especially black youth, then you and I have a very serious problem." In that instant, the power dynamic shifted. The airline executive knew exactly who was calling. Charles Ellis's company provided critical digital infrastructure to their fleet management. This was not a customer they could dismiss. This was a partner whose withdrawal could cost them millions. More than that, Charles had cultivated a reputation as a man who never let injustice go unanswered, whether in business or life. Here's what that moment teaches us. Transformation doesn't always begin with outrage. It begins with clarity, the ability to see the system for what it is and to intervene with tools that the system cannot ignore. Charles wasn't just calling as a father, he was calling as a strategist, aligning personal pain with professional leverage. Back on the plane, Jordan sat motionless, unaware of the storm gathering outside the cabin walls. The attendants thought they had cornered him. The passengers thought he was alone. But behind the quiet teenager holding his phone was a lineage of resilience. A father who understood both the fragility and the strength of reputation and who had no intention of letting his son's dignity be collateral damage. The spark had been lit. Now came the strategy, and in a matter of minutes, the entire aircraft would feel its heat. On board Flight 227, Jordan remained silent in his seat, outwardly composed, though his chest still burned with the sting of humiliation. What he did not know was that his silence had now become part of a much larger strategy. In corporate towers far above the city, calls were being placed, directives whispered, and a chain of authority snapping taut like a wire pulled too tight. The attendants believed they were holding control, but in reality, their grip was loosening by the second. Charles Ellis had mobilized his influence with deliberate precision. He didn't flood the airline with threats. He didn't post a video or ignite outrage online. Instead, he worked quietly, calling the right people, framing the situation with undeniable clarity. This is not just about one seat. It's about a culture you are either upholding or dismantling. Decide now which side you are on. That was the language executives understood. It wasn't just moral. It was operational. Reputation, liability, systemic exposure. Meanwhile, Jordan's quiet resistance inside the cabin was doing something important of its own. Social psychologists call it the power of nonviolent presence. By not escalating, he avoided feeding into stereotypes designed to discredit him. Instead, his stillness became a mirror, reflecting back the aggression and discomfort of those trying to strip his place away. Passengers began to shift uneasily in their seats, some realizing that perhaps they were witnessing not entitlement, but injustice. One older woman leaned toward the aisle as if about to speak, then sat back, guilt pressing on her silence. Step by step, the silent climb began. Charles's call reached a vice president. The vice president dialed operations control. A directive was issued: hold the plane. And just like that, time bent around Jordan. Engines powered down, cabin crew whispered into radios. The momentum of departure stalled. What had begun as a dismissal of a boy in the wrong seat was rapidly transforming into a matter commanding corporate urgency. Here's what that moment teaches us. True power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it moves invisibly, like a tide that shifts beneath the surface. While Jordan appeared to be just another teenager gripping his phone, a larger architecture of justice was assembling around him. The attendants could not see it yet, but their authority was already eroding. The climb was steady, deliberate, almost invisible. But every quiet step was building toward the moment when the balance of power would no longer be hidden. It would break into the open, undeniable to all. And that moment was approaching fast. The cabin doors, which should have been sealed by now, stayed open. A low murmur rippled through the rows as the engines idled longer than usual. Flight attendants, moments earlier so firm and certain, now moved with restless energy, whispering into handsets, their eyes flicking toward Jordan as though he were no longer a boy to be dismissed, but the center of something they could not control. Passengers began asking questions. Why aren't we leaving? Is there a delay? Their voices grew louder, demanding answers that the crew could not provide. Then it happened. The lead attendant returned to Jordan's row, her tone strikingly different from before. Her voice lacked the edge of command. Instead, it carried the clipped restraint of someone under sudden scrutiny. "Mr. Ellis," she said carefully, "we apologize for the misunderstanding. You may, of course, remain in your seat." The shift was not subtle. Where moments ago Jordan's legitimacy had been questioned, it was now being affirmed publicly, under the weight of invisible authority pressing down on the crew. But the reversal did not end there. Over the intercom, the captain's voice cut through the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently experiencing a brief delay due to operational instructions. Thank you for your patience." To most passengers, it sounded routine. To Jordan, it was confirmation. His father's influence had reached the cockpit. The entire plane, every passenger, every crew member, was now grounded because a young black teenager's dignity had been challenged. The attendants' faces told the story without words. Their confidence drained, their movements subdued. They avoided Jordan's eyes. In that silence, the power dynamic had shifted completely. What began as humiliation had turned into vindication, not through shouting, not through anger, but through strategy, lineage, and the quiet precision of leverage applied at the right moment. Here's what that moment teaches us. Justice, when it arrives, rarely announces itself with fanfare. It reveals itself in the reversal, when those who dismissed you are forced to recognize the truth they tried to erase. Jordan didn't just reclaim his seat. He forced the system to reckon with its own bias in front of everyone. The cabin, that once felt like a courtroom of judgment, was now a theater of revelation. The boy they thought powerless was seated firmly in place, and the very plane that carried them could not move until his dignity was restored. But every reversal leaves an aftermath. And for those who tried to strip him of his right to belong, the consequences were only beginning. When the aircraft finally lifted from the runway, the atmosphere had shifted in ways words alone could not explain. Jordan sat upright in his seat, no longer shrinking beneath the weight of others' assumptions. The attendants, once so confident in their authority, now moved quietly through the cabin, their professionalism suddenly sharpened by fear of accountability. The passengers who had watched in silence avoided his gaze, some with guilt heavy in their eyes, others with the unease of realizing they had witnessed not an inconvenience, but an injustice. Behind the scenes, the fallout was immediate. Charles Ellis's call had not ended with a single executive. A formal report had been requested mid-flight, and by the time the plane touched down, airline leadership was already preparing statements. The attendants would be interviewed, the chain of decisions dissected, and policies revisited. It wasn't about punishing individuals alone. It was about exposing a culture that allowed such assumptions to feel natural in the first place. For Jordan, the redemption was quieter, but more profound. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't been dragged from the plane. He hadn't become another viral headline of brutality. Instead, he had endured, held his ground, and allowed truth to surface through strategy and patience. He realized something powerful. Dignity is not only reclaimed in loud victories. Sometimes it is restored in the silence after the system has been forced to correct itself. Here's what that moment teaches us. Transformation doesn't end with the reversal of power. It continues with the ripple effect that follows. Every passenger who witnessed that delay would carry the story. A reminder that assumptions can backfire, that quiet resilience has weight, and that injustice, when confronted with strategy, can halt even a machine as vast as an airline. For the attendants, the lesson was undeniable. For the airline, it was costly. But for Jordan, it was something deeper. Proof that he did not need to question his right to belong. That seat was his, not by favor, not by charity, but by merit. And no dismissal, no humiliation could strip that truth from him again. But the story does not end on the plane, because what happened that day became more than an incident. It became a legacy. When Jordan stepped off that plane, he carried more than his luggage. He carried a truth that echoed louder than any announcement. Over the intercom, respect must never be conditional. His journey had begun with suspicion, was nearly derailed by prejudice, and yet ended with restoration, not because someone granted it, but because he refused to surrender it. That is the real legacy of this story. What happened on that flight was not just about one man. It was about all of us. How many moments do we witness injustice and stay silent, convincing ourselves it is not our fight? How often do we let stereotypes dictate reality, forgetting that each assumption has the power to wound, exclude, and diminish? The lesson here is piercingly clear. Silence sustains injustice, but courage, even quiet, deliberate courage, disrupts it. The next time you see someone cornered by unfairness, remember Jordan. Remember that your voice, your presence, and your refusal to turn away can alter the outcome. And if you are the one being tested, remember this too. Dignity is not a gift others can take. It is a truth you defend, step by step, breath by breath, until the world is forced to recognize it. This is more than a story about a flight. It is a reminder that the real turbulence is not in the air, but in the systems we allow to persist unchallenged. And just like a plane correcting its course mid-sky, justice begins when one person insists that the path must change. So I leave you with this. When the moment comes, and it will you remain silent in your seat, or will you stand, steady and unshaken like Jordan, until the ground beneath injustice shifts?